The impetus for this was trying to understand my parents' immigration from China and how they survived living in the Deep South, where they ran a laundry in a small town in Georgia, where their family was the only Chinese in town. It wasn't until I retired that I actually got the idea that it would be worthwhile to write a book about it. Growing up, I really kind of either ignored or was just too busy doing other stuff to really, think about those types of issues. I was lucky then that I was able to find some organizations that invited me to give a talk about it. And the reaction of the audience was very reinforcing, was very encouraging. And I think that helped motivate me to see the value of what I was doing. I mean, it was beyond just writing about my family. It was amazing how many other people in the audience had similar experiences, and they found it very gratifying to hear me talk about issues of the Chinese immigrants growing up in laundries, not only in the South, but everywhere across the US and Canada. One person came up to me and said, you have told my story, which meant basically there was a lot of similarity. And so it was gratifying for them, and it was sort of like recognition in a sense.
Switching from being a psychology professor to public history of Chinese America, this is a big change.
But actually, when I look back on it in hindsight, my interest in psychology and understanding how people think and feel and react to other people really was sort of a foundation for my work in Chinese American history. Because I wasn't really interested in history as a matter of facts in terms of dates, places, laws, events. I was really interested in the life experiences of these immigrants. I was only going to do that one book, and people would joke to me and say, congratulations, now what's your next book? And my answer was, there is no next book. Well, I was wrong, but anyway, I said, there is no next book. I only have one life to write about. And so what happened was the second book came about was I was giving a talk in Los Angeles about Southern fried rice. And a fellow Southerner, Roland Chow, the late Roland Chow from Mississippi, who was living in LA, he got all excited and came up to me. He said, you should, what do you know about the Mississippi Chinese? And I said, well, I don't really know much about them. I know one person from college who came from Mississippi. So he said, I'll introduce you to all these people from Mississippi who are living in California or whatever. And so I said, well, I'll think about it. It's kind of, wouldn't on the spur of the moment decide to do it.
About your parents. Why did your parents come to Macon, Georgia, knowing that they have strong negative feelings toward the Chinese? Didn't they know this?
They didn't really know much about the country, but they had relatives or friends who helped them when they first arrived. So at the time I was growing up, I didn't know all this, but it was later after I started doing family history research on my own family. I discovered that we had a bunch of Chinese men, relatives of my, great-great-grandfather who actually was settling in the South, and they all ran laundries. And my father had a grand uncle who actually was running a laundry in Chattanooga. And I know that when my father first came, he went to Chattanooga, not to Macon. So he went there because he knew somebody. He knew someone who could help him get adjusted, find him employment, and learn how to do laundry, basically, because he didn't know how to do laundry in China. None of those men who came over did laundry in China. They came to the United States and they ended up doing laundry because they were prohibited from doing a lot of other more lucrative businesses. And laundry was like the default.
In your early years during the Jim Crow era, how did you feel about public schools, public transportation, and the toilets? How did you feel
In the
about
South,
those?
there was a strong racial segregation, mostly between blacks and whites, because there really weren't very many what they called Orientals. And actually, they even before that, they called them Celestials. Anyway, there weren't very many Chinese in the South, so segregation was really a main issue between blacks and white. So then the question was, when these Chinese get there, they're not black and they're not white, so how are they going to be treated? In some cities, they were treated as if they were black. In other cities, they were treated as they were, quote, almost white. In other words, it depended on the city and things like that. Now, in Macon, since we were the only Chinese, we were probably treated better because we were treated as individuals. They didn't see us as a big threat.
Although John Jung's family was the only Chinese family in town, their white neighbors were very friendly to them. He was able to go to a white school and use the washroom and drinking fountain reserved for white men. He did not encounter any racial prejudice.
I saw the segregation as a child, and I, puzzled by it a little bit, but I was not badly treated. A lot of my friends in California, when they heard I was from Georgia, they thought it must have been really terrible for me. But actually, I didn't have a problem. I got to go to a white school, which was better quality than the black schools in terms of funding and teaching. I didn't really ride the bus because it's a small town. But if I did ride the bus, I could have sat in the front with the white people. I wouldn't have to sit in the back, the way it was in most cities.
But he still remembers clearly his mother reminding him frequently that as they were on alien soil, they would always be targets of prejudice.
But we were always sort of like, as I found out later, Chinese were second-class citizens at best.
Why did your family move to San Francisco, being the only Chinese family in Macon, Georgia? Why would they move to San Francisco where they have more population of Chinese in the U.S.? What impact did it have on you?
Their plan was to eventually retire and go back to China. But of course the war prevented that, and communist takeover. But we as children would say, well, we're not going to China with you. If you go to China, we're going to stay here. Like we were Americanized, which was always a problem for immigrant families, was the disconnect in a way between the parents with their, Chinese culture and us growing up in America and, learning American customs. They wanted to move out of Georgia so my two older sisters could be Chinese eligible men for marriage. I was only 15 when we moved, so that wasn't a concern about them that they had for me. So anyway, it was pretty amazing. We just pretty much just kind of got on the train and moved to California. So it was a big adjustment. Growing up in Georgia, I knew I was Chinese, but I didn't really know what that meant entirely. My parents spoke Chinese, we ate Chinese food, so I knew that much about it. But once I got to San Francisco and met other peers, in school, in high school, who were Chinese, I kind of saw how I was different from them in some way. I mean, we related, we were accepting of each other, but I gradually, I became, if you will, more Chinese because of the move.
As a psychologist, did your background influence your professional career compared to others?
I did research and writing and published several books in psychology, and that was my identity as a professional. There wasn't that much activity at that time for psychologists doing research on Chinese Americans. My research had nothing to do with ethnic issues at all. Zero, totally unrelated. So in that sense, my professional background had nothing whatsoever to do with Chinese American history.
What was the common theme that led you to write 5 wonderful books, or was there one?
As I said before, I only planned to write one book. And after I wrote the second book, a similar thing happened. A man who ran a Chinese restaurant in LA said, you should write a book about Chinese restaurant history. And I sort of probably rolled my eyes because, I knew nothing about Chinese restaurants other than, being a customer. But I went and did some research for several months, and I suddenly saw the value of doing this history. And so it was a common denominator between the Chinese groceries and the Chinese restaurant people, and actually I actually did a book on Chinese laundries that extended way beyond my own family restaurant laundry. Because see, growing up, I didn't know there were laundries all over the country. I mean, I was, this was before the age of internet, so I knew that my uncle in Atlanta had a laundry. I knew that a cousin had a laundry in Augusta, but I didn't think anything of it. I didn't even know why they all ran laundries. Then later, when I did research during retirement, I found that virtually every town in America had a Chinese laundry, which, when you stop to think about it, is really kind of puzzling, especially as I said before, none of these people did laundry in China. So why all these laundries there? So I felt I had to write a book about that. Okay, so the common denominator, if you will, is that I'm looking at these immigrants and subsequently their families, their children. What was their life experience like doing laundry stuff? And one thing that's certainly in common with all these families, not to say that all these people had families, there were many Chinese who were bachelors in effect, although they had families maybe in China, but they lived alone because they couldn't get their family over due to immigration issues. But in these families of restaurants, grocery stores, laundries, it was a family run business. The children all had to work. Well, we didn't like it all the time when we were growing up, but, it taught us some discipline. It taught us the value of the family staying together. We learned how to negotiate with customers, with white and black customers.
What we see in these families, in the laundries, in the restaurants, and in the grocery stores, is how much the children had to work in those places, had work in their family businesses, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. We all learn how to deal with people as children. We learned how to deal with some pretty ornery adults.
How do you see Chinese of America today compared to when you were a child?
Yeah, well, there's a huge difference in many ways. The Chinese who grew up like in the 20s and 30s, they had limited job opportunities. There's stories of people getting advanced degrees, Chinese getting advanced degrees in college and not being able to get a job because of prejudice. And now, Chinese are breaking through in all realms. They're not just doing manual labor things. They're financiers, they're lawyers, they're even into the entertainment industry. They're getting advances in motion pictures. And even now we have Yang, being a candidate possibly for president.
There's a phrase among Asian Americans and Chinese Americans particularly, forever foreign. Are we forever foreign? And I had this image I was going to show you of Michelle Kwan, Olympic figure skater about 10 or 15 years ago in the Olympics, and she didn't get first place. And the headline said, "American defeats Kwan." Now, Kwan was born in Torrance, California, so if she wasn't American, what was she?
After all these years, do you feel that this is still an issue and relevant now?
Well, yeah, certainly. I mean, as I just indicated, the political wind, the social attitudes shift. They're not always constantly, they don't always go in one direction. So we get improvement and then we get deterioration or, decay. And so if there were, because also we have more immigrants from China, from mainland, from Taiwan and everything. So the situation is more complicated in terms of what is the definition of Chinese American? It's shifted, it's broadened, it's widened. And so it's not monolithic, it's not homogeneous. There are different subsets or subpopulations of who the Chinese in America are. And they don't all agree with each other, but yet we're all seen as one group. And so whatever bad attitudes there are toward Chinese in America is going to affect all those Chinese in America.
I know the younger generation, I don't want to overgeneralize, but is not as interested in this because it just seems so, back in the past. They just can't get a clue that this ever happened. But if you don't learn about this, there's a danger it will happen again, that you need to know this history of how Chinese have been treated in the United States and what they've had to overcome. And to be able to maintain that is helpful for them to know, this overview of the history of Chinese America.
Looking at your background and all your accomplishments and successes, what might you have done better, maybe differently?
I did a lot of stuff pretty much on my own, independently, because I didn't have the right connections. But I've learned that having advice from people who are very knowledgeable has been very helpful. And I've been very fortunate in making over my 5 books, as I got more widely known, incredible amounts of support from accomplished scholars in academia. They've encouraged me, they've given me advice, and I've improved in that. So the answer is, I would have probably wanted to widen my network even more, worked on that. I think that would have improved the quality or the comprehensiveness of my work. And I've also been able to increasingly reach non-Chinese audiences, especially Caucasian audiences. And this is something I want to work on, because when I talk to mostly Chinese audiences, especially older ones, I'm basically preaching to the choir. Reaching audiences who don't know this history, who are not Chinese, would be a very powerful influence or effect, and that's something that motivates me and drives me. But basically, I feel like I'm making good use of my retirement. I'm meeting a lot of interesting people, and I'm also, learning a lot of things that are really intriguing to me about Chinese American history.